Rain had long since disappeared from the quiet college town, but the silence it left behind would become far more unsettling than any storm. In the early hours of a cold November morning, while most of the town of Moscow, Idaho slept without a second thought, something unfolded inside an ordinary house that would send shockwaves across America and eventually capture the attention of millions around the world. Four university students with promising futures would never see another sunrise, and for weeks, investigators faced a mystery that seemed almost impossible to solve. There were no immediate arrests, no public suspect, and very few answers. Rumors spread faster than facts. Every passing day deepened the uncertainty. Yet behind the scenes, detectives, forensic specialists, and analysts were quietly assembling thousands of tiny pieces of evidence, convinced that somewhere within an ocean of digital footprints, surveillance footage, DNA analysis, and witness accounts lay the identity of the person responsible. Months later, when authorities announced the arrest of a doctoral student studying criminology, many people found themselves asking the same unsettling question. How could someone pursuing advanced studies in criminal justice become the central figure in one of the most closely watched murder investigations in modern America? Was it coincidence, contradiction, or something far more complex? The answers would emerge not through sensational rumors or internet speculation, but through an investigation that relied on patience, technology, and painstaking forensic work. This is the story of Bryan Kohberger, the investigation that led authorities to him, and the case that continues to influence conversations about forensic science, criminal investigations, and the limits of understanding the human mind. Long before his name dominated news headlines across the globe, Bryan Christopher Kohberger lived a life that, to many who knew him casually, appeared remarkably ordinary. Born on November 21, 1994 in Pennsylvania, he grew up in a family that valued education and stability. Like many young people, he experienced the ordinary challenges of adolescence: school, friendships, personal struggles, and the search for identity. Those who crossed paths with him at different stages of his life often remembered different versions of the same person. Some recalled someone intelligent and quiet. Others described him as socially awkward or intensely focused. A few remembered someone who appeared determined to reinvent himself over time. As a teenager, Kohberger reportedly struggled with weight before making a significant commitment to improving his physical fitness. Friends and former classmates would later tell reporters that he became increasingly disciplined about exercise and nutrition, transforming both his appearance and his daily routine. Such personal changes are not unusual, and many people reinvent themselves during adolescence. At the time, few would have imagined that years later, journalists would revisit nearly every chapter of his life, searching for clues that might explain events that had not yet occurred. His academic interests gradually centered on psychology and criminal behavior. Rather than choosing a path toward engineering, medicine, or business, he became fascinated with understanding why crimes occur and how offenders think. This interest eventually led him to study criminal justice, a field that combines psychology, sociology, law, and investigative methods. Students entering such programs pursue many different careers. Some become police officers. Others work as researchers, analysts, lawyers, corrections professionals, or university professors. Studying crime does not suggest criminal intent any more than studying medicine predicts illness. Nevertheless, after his arrest, many observers found themselves revisiting this academic choice through an entirely different lens. Kohberger earned his undergraduate degree before continuing his education at DeSales University in Pennsylvania, where he pursued graduate studies in criminal justice. During this period, one particular detail would later receive widespread attention. Reports emerged that he had participated in research exploring how criminals make decisions during and after offenses. The survey, intended for academic purposes, asked participants about emotions, planning, and behavior related to criminal acts. Research of this kind is common within criminology programs and seeks to improve scientific understanding of criminal behavior. At the time, it attracted little public attention. Only after investigators identified Kohberger as a suspect did the survey become a subject of intense discussion, with many people wondering whether it carried deeper significance. Authorities never suggested that conducting academic research itself constituted evidence of criminal conduct, yet public fascination with the survey became impossible to ignore. Determined to continue advancing academically, Kohberger enrolled in the doctoral criminology program at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. The campus lay only a short drive from the neighboring University of Idaho in Moscow. The two college towns shared students, businesses, sporting events, and daily traffic. Thousands of young adults moved freely between them without giving the short journey a second thought. For Bryan Kohberger, Relocating across the country represented another opportunity to build a career centered on the scientific study of crime. Doctoral students often spend countless hours reading research papers, assisting professors, grading assignments, and conducting independent investigations. Their lives revolve around deadlines, presentations, and academic expectations. By most outward appearances, Kohberger seemed to be pursuing precisely that path. Meanwhile, only a few miles away, 4 University of Idaho students were living lives filled with ambitions, friendships, and ordinary college experiences. Haley Goncalves was preparing for an exciting new chapter after graduation. Friends described her as energetic, caring, and deeply connected to the people around her. She had recently returned to Moscow for what was expected to be a joyful weekend, spent reconnecting with close friends before beginning a new job elsewhere. Madison Mogen shared a close friendship with Kaylee that had developed over many years. Those who knew her remembered her kindness, optimism, and ability to make others feel welcome. Their bond reflected the type of friendship often formed during childhood and strengthened through shared milestones into adulthood. Donna Kernodle was known for her outgoing personality and determination. She balanced academics, work, and friendships while building a future she looked forward to. Alongside her was her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, remembered by family and friends as generous, approachable, and deeply loved. Ethan's siblings also attended the university, making the tragedy especially devastating for an entire family whose lives revolved around education and community. None of them knew that the weekend ahead would become one of the most examined weekends in recent American criminal history. November 12, 2022, began much like any other Saturday in a college town. Football games, social gatherings, restaurant visits, and late-night conversations filled the streets with the familiar rhythm of university life. Students celebrated the weekend, attended parties, met friends, and returned home in the early morning hours. Surveillance cameras quietly recorded ordinary traffic. Cell phones connected to nearby towers as people texted, ordered food, checked social media, and arranged rides home. At the time, these countless digital records seemed completely insignificant. Days later, they would become critical pieces of one enormous investigative puzzle. Haley and Madison spent part of their evening visiting local establishments before stopping at a food truck. A live-stream camera near the truck captured moments that investigators would later examine frame by frame. After obtaining food, they returned home using a private ride service. Elsewhere, Zana and Ethan spent their evening together before eventually returning to the same residence. House at 1122 King Road was familiar to friends and classmates. Like many off-campus student homes, it accommodated multiple roommates whose schedules often differed. Lights turned on and off at different hours. Friends visited frequently. Deliveries arrived late into the night. It was the kind of home where activity rarely attracted attention because movement was simply part of everyday student life. As midnight passed and Sunday morning approached, the neighborhood grew quieter. Some students continued celebrating elsewhere while others settled into bed after long evenings out. Unknown to everyone inside the King Road house, investigators would later conclude that someone had already begun a sequence of actions that would fundamentally alter countless lives. Hours later, shortly before noon on November 13, emergency responders received a call that would launch one of the most extensive homicide investigations Idaho had ever seen. Officers arriving at the residence encountered a scene unlike anything the quiet university community had experienced in generations. The immediate priority became securing the property, identifying everyone present, and protecting every possible piece of forensic evidence. Detectives understood that every footprint, fingerprint, fiber, electronic device, and biological sample might eventually help reconstruct the events of that night. Outside the home, confusion quickly spread. Students noticed police vehicles. Parents began calling their children. University officials issued emergency alerts, initially providing limited information while investigators worked to determine exactly what had happened. The absence of immediate answers fueled fear throughout Moscow. Many residents locked their doors earlier than usual. Businesses discussed additional security measures. Students debated whether to return home or remain on campus. Rumors multiplied across social media, often outpacing verified information. Investigators faced enormous pressure. 4 young lives had been lost, the community demanded answers, and there was no immediate arrest. Every public statement had to balance transparency with protecting the integrity of an active investigation. Releasing too much information could compromise future interviews or alert a potential suspect. Saying too little invited speculation that investigators were falling behind. Behind closed doors, however, the investigation was expanding at remarkable speed. Local police received assistance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Idaho State Police, forensic laboratories, behavioral analysts, and digital evidence specialists. Hundreds of tips poured in from across the country. Thousands of photographs, videos, and surveillance recordings were collected for review. Every second of available footage from nearby homes, businesses, traffic cameras, and university facilities became valuable. Detectives mapped vehicle movements, reconstructed timelines, analyzed phone records, and interviewed friends, classmates, professors, neighbors, and anyone who might have crossed paths with the victims during their final days. What initially appeared to be an investigation with almost no obvious direction slowly began revealing patterns that would eventually narrow an almost unimaginable number of possibilities into one name. For days, the investigation unfolded largely out of public view. Detectives understood that the smallest, overlooked detail could determine whether the person responsible was ever identified. Every room inside the King Road residence was photographed repeatedly before evidence was collected. Specialists documented the position of furniture, examined entry points, searched for fingerprints, footwear impressions, trace fibers, and every biological sample that might later prove significant. Modern homicide investigations rely on the principle that even the most careful offender may unknowingly leave behind microscopic evidence. The challenge is finding it, preserving it, and interpreting it correctly. While forensic teams worked inside the house, another group of investigators focused on reconstructing the victim's final known movements. They traced credit card transactions, reviewed surveillance footage from businesses, examined social media activity, and interviewed everyone who had interacted with the 4 students in the hours leading up to the tragedy. Friends described ordinary conversations about weekend plans. Family members spoke of phone calls that now carried heartbreaking significance. Nothing in those final interactions appeared to suggest that anyone anticipated danger. Public concern continued to grow. The lack of an arrest led to difficult questions. Was this a targeted attack? Was the community at risk? Should students leave campus? Officials urged patience while emphasizing that the investigation was progressing, even if many of its details could not yet be shared. Law enforcement also appealed directly to the public for photographs, videos, and any information from the area during the early morning hours of November 13. Thousands responded. Among the countless pieces of digital evidence collected were hours of surveillance recordings from residential security cameras and nearby businesses. At first glance, many clips showed nothing more than quiet streets and the occasional passing vehicle. But detectives knew that patterns often emerge only after footage is synchronized with precise timelines. As analysts compared one recording with another, they noticed a light-colored sedan appearing multiple times in the vicinity of the King Road neighborhood during the early morning hours. The vehicle seemed to pass through the area repeatedly before eventually leaving at a higher rate of speed. Individually, each appearance might have meant very little. College towns see vehicles coming and going at all hours. Taken together, however, the repeated movements drew investigators' attention. Vehicle identification specialists began narrowing the possibilities. Based on available footage, they believed the car was a white Hyundai Elantra from a model range produced during the early 2010s. That determination became one of the investigation's first major public breakthroughs. Police announced they wanted to identify the occupants of a white Hyundai Elantra seen near the crime scene around the relevant timeframe. They stressed that they believed the occupants might possess information valuable to the investigation. The wording was deliberate. Detectives often avoid immediately labeling someone a suspect while evidence is still being developed. Across the country, law enforcement agencies reviewed vehicle registration databases. Universities checked parking records. Tips flooded in from people who owned similar cars or believed they had seen one matching the description. Investigators suddenly had a concrete lead to pursue. At the same time, another branch of the investigation was unfolding inside forensic laboratories. Crime scenes can contain enormous amounts of biological material, much of it entirely unrelated to the offense. Technicians must carefully separate relevant evidence from background contamination accumulated through ordinary daily life. The King Road residence, like many shared student homes, had welcomed numerous visitors over time. That reality made forensic interpretation particularly challenging. Despite those complexities, analysts identified a DNA sample recovered from an item found at the scene that investigators believed could be associated with the offender. Rather than providing an immediate identity, the sample functioned like a fingerprint without a name attached. It represented someone, but who? That question would remain unanswered for weeks. Meanwhile, investigators expanded their digital analysis. Cell phones constantly communicate with nearby towers, generating records that can sometimes help establish general locations. Such records are not precise enough to identify someone's exact position inside a building, but they can assist investigators in reconstructing broader travel patterns when combined with other evidence. Detectives examined millions of data points from devices operating within relevant timeframes. They also requested information through legal processes from telecommunications providers, seeking to understand which phones appeared repeatedly in locations connected to the investigation. This work required extraordinary patience. Unlike fictional crime dramas where computers instantly reveal answers, real investigations involve months of data organization, legal review, technical analysis, and careful verification. Every conclusion must withstand courtroom scrutiny. Assumptions are not enough. Investigators need evidence that can be independently supported. As analysts continued reviewing surveillance footage, they refined the route taken by the white Hyundai Elantra. Camera after camera appeared to capture what investigators believed was the same vehicle traveling through neighboring communities before and after the estimated time of the offenses. Each additional sighting strengthened the timeline. Then came another important development. Law enforcement agencies searching vehicle databases identified a white Hyundai Elantra registered to a graduate student at Washington State University in nearby Pullman. The owner was Bryan Kohberger. On its own, owning a similar vehicle did not establish guilt. Thousands of identical cars existed across the United States. Detectives understood they needed considerably more evidence before drawing conclusions. Investigators quietly began learning everything they could about Kohberger. Public records, academic enrollment, employment information, vehicle registrations, and known addresses were examined. Officers conducted surveillance without attracting attention. They observed daily routines, documented movements, and compared emerging information against evidence already collected. One detail reportedly caught investigators' attention. According to the probable cause affidavit later filed in court, historical cell phone records suggested that a device associated with Kohberger had been in the vicinity of the King Road neighborhood on multiple occasions before the November 13 killings. Investigators did not claim these records proved he visited the residence itself. Rather, they argued that the repeated presence of the device in the broader area was relevant when considered alongside other evidence. Again, each individual fact remained insufficient on its own. A white Hyundai Elantra, a graduate student in criminology, cell phone records indicating repeated presence in the area. None of these independently established criminal responsibility. The investigation's strength depended on whether numerous independent pieces of evidence could eventually point toward the same conclusion. As surveillance continued, authorities learned that Kohberger had traveled from Washington back to Pennsylvania with his father during the university's winter break. The cross-country drive itself was not unusual. Many students return home for holidays. Nevertheless, investigators maintained their interest. Working alongside federal authorities, law enforcement officers discreetly monitored the family's residence. According to later reporting, investigators recovered discarded items from household trash left outside the home. Forensic scientists compared DNA obtained from those items with the unknown DNA profile recovered from evidence collected at the King Road crime scene. The comparison did not immediately identify Bryan Kohberger directly. Instead, laboratory analysis reportedly indicated that the DNA recovered from the discarded material was consistent with originating from the biological father of the unknown individual, whose DNA had been recovered from the crime scene evidence. That result dramatically narrowed the field. It suggested investigators were looking at the correct family. Armed with this and other evidence developed during weeks of investigation, authorities prepared arrest warrants and coordinated a carefully planned operation. In the early hours of December 30, 2022, officers surrounded the Pennsylvania residence where Kohberger was staying. Tactical teams moved into position, while investigators ensured every detail had been coordinated to minimize risk to everyone involved. Before sunrise, Bryan Kohberger was taken into custody without a reported exchange of gunfire. Within hours, the news spread around the world. After nearly 7 weeks of uncertainty, investigators had identified a suspect. Television networks interrupted regular programming. News websites published breaking alerts. Social media erupted with reactions ranging from relief to disbelief. Yet even as headlines declared an arrest, experienced prosecutors understood that the case was entering an entirely new phase. An arrest is not a conviction. The legal process was only beginning. Over the following days, authorities unsealed the probable cause affidavit, a document outlining the evidence investigators believed justified the charges. Millions of people read its contents, examining every detail for clues about how detectives had connected Bryan Kohberger to one of the most closely watched homicide investigations in recent American history. And with every page that became public, the picture grew more detailed, but also more complex. The months that followed transformed the case from an active manhunt into one of the most closely watched criminal prosecutions in recent American history. Court filings, evidentiary hearings, and legal arguments replaced the daily speculation that had dominated headlines during the investigation. Prosecutors continued building their case around a combination of forensic evidence, surveillance footage, digital records, witness statements, and investigative analysis. The defense challenged aspects of that evidence while emphasizing that every defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. As in any major criminal case, the courtroom, not public opinion, would ultimately determine the legal outcome. The proceedings attracted extraordinary public attention. News organizations covered nearly every development, legal experts debated the significance of new filings, and online discussions often blurred the line between verified information and speculation. Throughout the process, the court repeatedly reminded those involved that decisions must be based on admissible evidence rather than rumors or commentary circulating on social media. Eventually, the case reached its legal conclusion. Bryan Kohberger was convicted in connection with the murders of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, bringing to a close one of the most extensive homicide investigations in Idaho's history. For the victims' families, however, no verdict could restore the futures that had been taken from them. Court proceedings may provide legal accountability, but they cannot erase grief or replace the years of birthdays, graduations, careers, marriages, and ordinary moments that will never be lived. Investigation also demonstrated how modern policing has evolved. Detectives did not rely on a single dramatic breakthrough. Instead, they assembled countless pieces of information: DNA analysis, surveillance video, digital records, vehicle tracking, witness interviews, and forensic science, until those independent strands formed a coherent investigative picture. It was a reminder that in today's world, the smallest detail can become significant when viewed alongside dozens of others. The case sparked broader conversations as well. Universities reviewed campus safety measures. Students became more aware of personal security. Researchers, legal scholars, and criminologists examined the investigation from multiple perspectives, discussing everything from forensic technology to the ethical responsibilities of those who study criminal behavior. At the same time, the case underscored the importance of distinguishing verified facts from online speculation, particularly during high-profile investigations where misinformation can spread rapidly. Yet beyond the headlines, legal filings, and media coverage lies a simpler and more enduring truth. This story is ultimately not about the notoriety of a defendant. It is about 4 young people whose lives ended far too soon, leaving behind families, friends, and a university community forever changed. Kaylee Goncalves was remembered for her adventurous spirit and unwavering loyalty. Madison Mogen was known for her warmth and ability to make people feel welcome. Zana Kernodle was admired for her determination and vibrant personality. Ethan Chapin was celebrated for his kindness, optimism, and the joy he brought to those around him. Their names deserve to be remembered not because of the tragedy that claimed their lives, but because of the lives they lived before that tragedy occurred. Perhaps that is the most important